I was this chubby-cheeked 5-year-old. When I joined my family on the picket line for the first time, I'd stand on a street corner in the heavy Kansas humidity, surrounded by a few dozen relatives, with my tiny fist clutching this sign that I couldn't even read yet. Gays are worthy of death. This was only the beginning. Our protest soon became a daily occurrence and an international phenomenon. As a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, I became this fixture on picket lines across the country. We all assume that our morals and beliefs are righteous, and that those who oppose them are somehow wrong and unethical. Megan Phelps Ropers abandons this belief when she tells her story of why she left the Westboro Baptist Church and remains estranged from her entire family. Taken from the TED Talk, I Grew Up in the Westboro Baptist Church, Here's Why I Left, delivered in February of 2017 in New York City. The end of my picketing career, and quite frankly, as life as I knew it, came years later, in part triggered by these strangers on Twitter who showed me the power of engaging the other. In my home, life was framed as this epic spiritual battle between the good and the evil. The good being my church and its members, and the evil was everyone else. My church's antics were such that we were constantly at odds with the rest of the world. And somehow this reinforced our otherness on a daily basis. From baseball games to military funerals, we trekked across the country with neon protest signs in hand to tell others exactly how unclean they were and exactly why they were headed for damnation. This was the focus of our whole lives. I believed what I was taught with all of my heart, and I pursued Westboro's agenda with a special sort of zeal. In 2009, that zeal brought me to Twitter. Now, initially, the people I encountered on that platform were, to be honest, just as hostile as I expected. But in the midst of that digital brawl, a strange pattern developed. Someone would arrive at my profile with the usual rage and scorn, but I'd respond with a custom mix of Bible verses, pop culture references, and smiley faces. Now, they'd be understandably confused, but then a conversation would ensue. How had the other come to such outrageous conclusions about the world? Sometimes, you see, these conversations even bled into real life. People I'd sparred with on Twitter would come out to see me at a picket line. David was one such person. After months of heated, but somehow friendly arguments online, he came out to see me at a picket when I protested in his city. He brought me a Middle Eastern dessert from Jerusalem, where he lives, and I brought him a kosher chocolate. But I held a God hates Jews sign. There was no confusion about our positions, but that line between friend and foe was becoming blurred. We'd started to see each other as actual human beings, and it completely changed the way we spoke to one another. It took time, but eventually these conversations planted seeds of doubt in me. My friends on Twitter took the time to understand Westboro's doctrines, and in doing so, they found these inconsistencies I missed my entire life. Why did we advocate the death penalty for gays when Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone"? How could we claim to love our neighbor while at the same time praying for God to destroy them? Once I realized that we were not the arbiters of this divine truth, but quite frankly, just flawed human beings. I couldn't pretend otherwise. I couldn't justify our actions, especially our cruel practices. Despite overwhelming terror and grief, I left Westboro in 2012. In those days just after I left, the instinct to hide was almost paralyzing. I wanted to hide from the judgment of my family, who I knew would never speak to me again. People whose thoughts and opinions had meant everything to me. I wanted to hide from the world I'd rejected for so long. People who had no reason at all to give me a second chance. And yet, unbelievably, they did. All I could do was to try to build a new life and to find a way somehow to repair some of the damage. I spent my first year adrift with my younger sister, who had thankfully chosen to leave with me. We walked into this abyss, but we were shocked to find a light forward in the same communities we targeted for so long. David, my friend from Twitter, he invited us to stay among a Jewish community in Los Angeles. These people treated us like family. They held nothing against us. And again, I was astonished. This has been at the front of my mind lately because I can't help but notice in our own public discourse the same destructive impulses that ruled my former church. We celebrate tolerance and diversity more than at any other time in history, and still we grow more and more divided. We want good things, justice, equality, dignity, freedom, prosperity. And yet that path that we've chosen looks so much like the one I walked away from 4 years ago. We write off half the world as out of touch, liberal elites, or racist, misogynist bullies. No nuance, no complexity, no humanity. We routinely refuse to acknowledge the merits in our opponent's positions or the flaws in our own positions. What gives me hope, though, is that we can do something about this. The good news is that it's simple. The bad news is that it's hard. We have to learn to talk and listen to people we disagree with. It's hard because we often can't fathom how the other side came to their position. It's hard because of righteous indignation, that sense of self-certainty that ours is the right side is so seductive. It's hard because it means extending empathy and compassion to those who show us hostility and contempt. But it has to be done. My mother said something to me in those weeks before I left Westboro, when I was desperately hoping that there was a way I could stay with my family. People who I've loved with all of my heart, even before I was that chubby-cheeked 5-year-old. She said to me, "You're just a human being, my dear, sweet child." She was asking me to be humble, not to question, but to trust God and my elders. But to me, she was missing the bigger picture, that we should approach one another with generosity and compassion and be guided by this most basic fact, that we're all just human beings.